So Emily is a biologist and author of Kids Questions. She answered Kids Questions Answered podcast with Dr. Danger. Sorry about that. While Illinois Native Plant Society president, Emily has also been an assistant professor of biology at Roosevelt University, teaching ecology, evolution, and organismal biology classes. Her research experience is in population and community ecology, especially of rare plants and species range limits. In addition to her work on starflowers, she continued previous work on mangrove expansion in Florida. Emily was a postdoctoral research fellow with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, and she received a bachelor's from Washington University and a PhD from Berkeley. She began researching rare plant population ecology as an undergraduate, working on sand dune plants in California. She's the author of over 15 peer-reviewed articles on ecology and a children's picture book called Meet the Trees. So Emily, thank you so much for coming, and I will stop share right now.
All right, thank you, Leslie. I'm excited to be here and present to you all. So as Leslie mentioned, I have done research on quite a few different species and ecosystems, and most of the things that connect them are geographic range limits and more recently climate change. So if I say anything that's a scientific term that you're unfamiliar with, please put it in the chat. And if I see it, I will respond in the moment, although I might not see it and then I'll respond afterwards. So
I can help with that too.
Thank you. Great. Yeah, just interrupt if needed. So today the topic of the talk is how is climate change disrupting native plants? And I'm currently the president of the Illinois Native Plant Society. I took a little break from doing that. I was previously president and I've had various jobs, as Leslie mentioned, so I'll just jump right in. So today I'll talk a little bit about just what plants can do to respond to climate change. I'll talk about a leading range edge expansion as one example, which is happening in Florida with mangroves and mangrove ecosystems and the species that make up mangroves. And then switch to talking about a trailing range edge for Illinois and the surrounding Midwestern area. So when I'm talking about range edges, if you consider a map of where a species lives, like where it occurs, you can draw a circle or something resembling a circle on a map of where a species is. So like this map right here is showing the upper Midwest and this species Trientalis borealis, which is the common name is starflower. And this is showing all the counties in which it's known to occur in a dark green color here. So you can see Illinois and the Chicago area are sort of at a southern limit, not necessarily the southern limit, but a southern limit. And so we would call that more of a like trailing edge populations. But then on the other hand, I'll talk about mangroves and we'll talk about populations at the leading edge of the range. And so you can typically, and this is not always the case, but often have sort of these disjunct populations at one end of the range, the geographic range, and then a more continuous populations that intermix a bit more in the middle. So when we talk about climate change, species have a few options, right? They can move. Animals in particular can move themselves, but plant species can move their pollen, move their seeds through dispersal. So that can result in a range shift where the whole geographic range is, say, shifting north or shifting upslope in the case of mountains. They can also contract their range, so their geographic range where they occur can be smaller or it can get bigger. It can expand. Species at the same time can be adapting to climate, right? Adapting to warmer temperatures, different precipitation regimes. They may develop different traits or just use traits differently that they already have, or they can die out. And we know that in the history of life on Earth, most species are extinct. Most species that have ever lived on Earth are extinct. So this is something that happens through geologic time. Of course, now the issue is that anthropomorphic climate change is happening much faster than climate change has happened in the past. And so some species will likely die out, but those of us that care about the life we have on Earth now will hopefully help the species that we have exist longer. So I'm start off with a little story about mangroves. So mangroves are tropical plants. I'll tell you more about them as we go on. But in Florida, Florida is really the only place that you could go and reliably find mangroves until maybe 15 or 20 years ago, when they also started encroaching in Texas too. But I'm going to focus on Florida today. So in northern Florida, around the St. Augustine, Jacksonville area, there's mostly salt marsh along the coast. And this woman here, Candy Feller, who was my postdoc advisor at the Smithsonian, was out in the salt marsh one day and found something that didn't belong. And what was that? It was a mangrove. This is actually a black mangrove, Avicennia germinans. It was living out here in the salt marsh, and that was really surprising. Candy happens to be an expert on mangroves and has traveled around the world studying them. And she knew that this tropical species did not belong out here in the salt marsh. So how did it get there? And what was it doing there? Well, as I mentioned, so just to, for those of you that aren't used to looking at pictures of plants, that's a mangrove there. It's the shrubby, bushy, they're woody organisms. And then the salt marsh species are more grassy, herbaceous species. So mangroves live along tropical coastlines around the world, shown here in green. There's some variation in their range. There's actually a lot more mangrove species in the Asia Pacific region than in the Americas and Western Africa, but we have 3 species here that are common, and you can find them in Florida, among other places: the black mangrove, red mangrove, and white mangrove. Mangroves are really important because they provide a lot of ecosystem services. So they can be nurseries for fish and shrimp. They are habitat and habitat, especially for a lot of birds, pelicans, and other water birds. They protect coastlines and from storm surges, tsunamis, hurricanes. They store carbon, and many commercial fish species actually use mangroves during part of their life cycle. So in Florida, the area that's around, so the range limit for mangroves in Florida occurs around 30 degrees north latitude, which is approximately where this red dotted line at the top is. Oops. And above that line, we typically just see salt marshes. So going up into Georgia and around the Gulf Coast, we see a lot of salt marsh, which is this herbaceous dominated ecosystem. South of about Cocoa Beach, we see mangrove forest dominate. So this might be more what people think of when they think of mangroves, like these taller trees. Sometimes people go canoeing or kayaking around them. They do create large forests, both like in the Everglades and then further south in Central America and other tropical places around the world. So mangroves can grow quite tall, but in this case, what I'm talking about today, it's mostly shorter. So then we get this mix of mangrove and salt marsh in an area called the ecotone, which is about 2 degrees of latitude in Florida. So there's been a lot of work over, at this point, the last 10 to 15 years, documenting what's going on with mangroves right now. And they're expanding poleward, meaning north, north in the US. And actually in Australia, they're moving landward. So these are species that rely on the tides and live along coastlines. They don't really grow inland. They are dispersed by water, but they are, with sea level rise, actually encroaching in salt marsh in Australia as well. So in 2014, there was a paper published by a colleague, that Kyle Kavanagh, who he showed using satellite imagery that mangroves have expanded, increased in their abundance in northern Florida, that ecotone that I just showed you on the previous map, and that increase in mangrove area is related to a decrease in the number of cold days. So in this case, there's a threshold at -4 degrees Celsius, which is just below freezing, above which mangroves increased, and below which they either didn't increase, they decreased, or stayed the same. Actually, the only decrease here in this red on the map is probably due to anthropogenic activity, like development. along the coast. So we know that in Florida, mangroves in northern Florida have doubled in area at least due in the last 30 years due to a lack of severe freezes. So these are really cold freezes. And what that looks like, this is Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. It's kind of near Cape Canaveral. There's a really beautiful area there called Black Point Drive. If you have a chance to go see it, you can drive through and you can see the sign here that was this photo was taken in 2005. Okay, so 20 years ago, this sign says salt marsh, but now zooming in, you see a lot of mangroves, which is those leaf-like, green leaf-like things kind of in among the brownish salt marsh grass. And then in 2016, it was all mangrove, which is interesting because that area, there are a lot of birds, water birds, and mangroves are not super welcome as a new arrival in that area, even though in some research I will show you, they have been there in the past. So this is at one point, we keep finding new northernmost mangroves, but at one point, this was the northernmost black mangrove, Avicennia germinans, on Amelia Island in northern Florida. You can see it's taller than a sort of average sized human man. So it's been there for a while, probably 12 to 13 years. And what our research group realized was that the timing of this, like just this one plant growing out in the salt marsh all by itself, may line up with the hurricane pattern that's happened in the past. So we think that this particular plant was recruited possibly during the 2004 hurricanes that occurred in this part of Florida. And we actually got a chance to test this as well. So using both genetic data and field studies, we examined how are these mangroves getting out into the salt marsh? How are they getting beyond their range limits? And we wanted to find out, are hurricanes a possibility, right? We know these are water dispersed propagules that float in the water and can start growing when they land somewhere, but how are they getting so far beyond their normal home? So in 2014, when there was no hurricane, we did some surveys along the beaches and we looked at what's called the rack line. So all this algae, this brown algae washing up here, if you comb through it, you can find lots of fun treasures and surprises, including these are mangrove propules. So these little green things are, they're not called seeds because they're still alive. They don't go through a dormant period, but they're propagules. They can grow into a new tree. So this is in 2014. And then we did this again in 2017 after Hurricane Irma hit. And we found, well, I'll show you what we found. In 2014, when there was no storm, the black dots represent the density of propagules along a latitudinal gradient. So basically saying that there were propagules, but at very low densities throughout that latitudinal gradient throughout the ecotone heading north. Then in 2017, after Hurricane Irma, we actually saw a big increase, particularly in some sites, but we saw much higher densities of propagules. Now, we found a lot of propagules. These were just for black mangroves. We also have data on red mangroves, Rhizophora mangli, but we are just showing the black mangroves because there's actually some difference in the dispersal, the timing, when they release their propagules, and this one had the most data we were able to show. So this is actually showing that hurricanes can move propagules beyond their current range limit. And we paired this up with a genetic analysis where we sampled existing trees in various populations. So you can just see kind of these different colored dots represent different populations along both coasts of Florida. And the sort of range margin, that range edge, are these blue dots here. And then that past the range margin represents those individual trees that I showed. So like this one tree kind of standing off by itself. So we were able to get genetic data from those. I'll flip back and find out that the hurricanes really are moving propagules north. So they're not necessarily bringing a whole bunch of propagules all at once from really far away, but they are mostly bringing propagules from the closest source population. So in this case, that might be these northern populations. So it's kind of interesting to think about that once a mangrove gets there and it can grow to reproduce, it can really have a big effect on future mangrove populations. So we know, I mentioned already that we know there's been mangroves in northern Florida in the past, or sort of at that edge, at that range edge. And there's this question was, did they just die off when there were a few severe freezes in the 1980s? Did they just die off and now they're coming back and then they're going to die off again, when the next severe freeze happens? So we did, and various other researchers were involved in this. I didn't do all of this myself, but we used aerial photography. So this is just one site. It's not a huge area. You can see the legend here shows 1 kilometer, right? So this is not a huge site, but we used some aerial imagery to see over time from 1942 to 2013 that mangroves in green actually increased and decreased in area throughout this site. And so the orange here is salt marsh, and then unvegetated, which in this case is water, is gray here. So you can see that through time we've had increases and decreases, and I'll show you this in just the same data, different graph. So the mangrove abundance is this dark solid line, and then the salt marsh abundance is the dotted line. And we can line up the increases in mangroves with hurricanes and the decreases in mangroves with freezes that happen. So we know based on historical records that in 1944 there was a hurricane, and then there was a period without a freeze, which accompanied an increase in mangroves. And then in 1962 and 1977, there were freezes. There were a series of 4 severe freezes in the 1980s. And then there's been a long spell now with no severe freezes and several hurricanes. We know also some of these records, it's really interesting, came from the citrus industry. There are certain, like those freezes in the 1980s and even before that, were enough to have a big impact on orange growth, and so that they're called impact freezes. But now we know a little bit more about mangrove physiology too, and what level of freeze they can sustain. So this is also, this is going back to 1942, right? But this is from aerial photography. But how do we know about life before that, right? What happened before 1942? So we don't have satellite imagery and we don't have aerial photos from that time period, but we have some other interesting sources. So this is the first time as a biologist I got to learn about historical research for biology purposes. This is a photo of Fort Matanzas, which was a Spanish fort in northern Florida near St. Augustine, or in St. Augustine. And then we used all sorts of interesting botanist journals, government records. This is called a T-sheet from NOAA that actually maps some of the mangroves, things written by John Muir, surveyors. So we have this whole litany of sources throughout history in Florida that showed when mangroves were in different places. And we realized that we actually can track them to their current range limit or close to it, which is this red star, going back in time. And actually, there's one source from John Muir who says he saw Avicennia as he was crossing the St. Mary's River, which is what divides Georgia and Florida. So they're now back up to that point, but it's pretty cool because no one really knew that until this historical analysis was done. So we put together a similar graph to what I showed you before, just through time, where we saw mangrove dominated in these, they're green here, and then salt marsh dominated in the orange, based on, some records of freezes from 1894, 1895, which devastated the citrus industry, and then photos, observations, journals. And so we can go through from the late 1860s up to present time and track this ebb and flow over time of mangroves. So what happens next? Will a severe freeze come and kill off all the mangroves once again? Possibly, but climate projections actually make it seem pretty hospitable to mangroves in Florida, in northern Florida in the future. The number of freezes is projected to decrease, and there's expected to be very few freezes in northern Florida. If there is one, they may survive it, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. I just wanted to mention some of the other things that are happening at this range edge in northern Florida because there's a lot going on and it's super interesting. So one thing that's going on is you can see, I mentioned before that like if in Everglades and in southern Florida, you see tall trees. At this northern range edge, they're really shrubby. Like this is a person, and these are still a bit in the, you know, background compared to where he is, but they're quite shrubby. This is about 35 centimeters. This is a red mangrove. And it's already branching out quite a bit, whereas in another site, it might just look like a little seedling with no branches yet. But they're out in they've got all this light. They're not under a canopy of other tall trees. They're just out there in the salt marsh doing their thing. And they are also reproducing earlier, which is really interesting too, because sometimes we think about species kind of at the physiological limit of what they can tolerate in terms of temperature, and that they might be stressed, they might not be reproducing very well. But we found that these plants are reproducing even earlier when they're smaller and younger than they are elsewhere in Florida. So we call this precocious reproduction, or babies having babies, which is super weird. Normally, these plants are 5 to 10 years old at least, or older when they reproduce, and they're large trees, but these are really tiny. This is a seedling. It looks like a seedling. It's 8 centimeters tall. I mean, it's tiny, and it's already got flowers. It's ready to reproduce and spread out. So I did some experiments looking at this specifically, and I'll just share this one slide that red mangroves are reproducing earlier in those northern populations. So I once again divided the study area of Florida into pure mangrove zone, middle of the ecotone, and then the northern part of the ecotone, because you can't study where they don't occur in this case. And I found that at the northern edge there was a higher percentage of plants reproducing than there are in the pure mangrove zone or the middle of the ecotone. And they did some other experiments too, but I want to move on and show you also that mangroves respond to nutrient additions. So we talk about climate change when we think about air temperature, but with coastal species, especially ocean sea level rise and ocean acidification are really important. So because mangroves are tidal and they live in the intertidal zone, they are periodically flooded. And as sea level is rising, that means that they're also getting whatever's in that seawater, wherever the mangroves occur, they're getting the nutrients in that seawater. So Candy Feller, my postdoc advisor from the Smithsonian, had done a whole bunch of experiments around the world looking at how how mangroves respond to nutrient additions, like nitrogen and phosphorus specifically, that can be found in seawater and often, especially in areas of pollution, near pollution. And so in this case, it depends on the site though, how they respond and what nutrient they're responding to. So in this case, the mangroves in northern Florida are growing taller and have larger canopies. They're growing wider and also reproducing more when they are fertilized with nitrogen, which is this middle bar here. So we have controls on the left, nitrogen treatment here, and phosphorus here. And then height is shown here, so they're taller in the nitrogen treatment. Their like a leaf area index is a measure of their canopy. And then the interesting thing is too, like if we look at how the mangroves affecting salt marsh species, the mangroves are starting to suppress their salt marsh neighbors, which is not so good for them. So these are a couple different species of salt marsh plants that we find out there. So then we had sort of a natural experiment that happened. So while we were doing this nitrogen or nutrient addition experiment, in 2018, there was a freeze and it was pretty cold. It didn't get below, well, it did hit -4 actually, which is, I mentioned earlier, one of that threshold for mangroves being able to persist in the case of a freeze. And there was a 3-day period where there were temperatures that were pretty cold, -4 and -2.8. and then also the first day was minus 1.1. The minus sign is on the wrong line there, so it's a little hard to tell. So here's a question. What do you think? This is before the freeze. This is after. You see some brown spots. Do you think the mangroves all died? Well, I'm here to tell you they didn't. The nitrogen fertilized plants actually suffered less damage than the other plants, than the control plants or the phosphorus plants. And a year and a half later, they all recovered. So you couldn't even tell there had been a freeze, which is pretty incredible that at this northern range limit, the plants are actually more freeze tolerant than they are if it were in Miami, let's say, and there was a freeze. So another question is, when we talk about mangroves, I've been focusing on the plant species, right? That in red mangrove, black mangrove, white mangrove, but there's lots of animals that are affiliated with these ecosystems too. And we know plants themselves form a habitat. I mentioned shrimp and fish and birds that like to use mangroves as habitat. There's a lot of insects and a lot of spiders that don't get talked about as much. There's also a very charismatic species called the mangrove tree crab, which you see here crawling into the water on a red mangrove root. So there was a student who did a PhD, several students, but one who did a PhD thesis on this mangrove tree crab and its expansion in Florida as well. And here it is in a black mangrove. It's actually climbing the trees. It's herbivorous on the leaves, so meaning it eats the leaves, but it's really omnivorous. Candy Feller, my postdoc advisor, has seen it eating other crabs, fish, etc. So the tree crab, it's interesting. If you had to take a moment and think, okay, these mangroves are moving north. This is a tropical tree crab or tropical mangrove tree crab. Is it going to move north with them, right? And maybe it'll move north, but maybe it'll lag behind a little bit. Maybe it won't, be as far north as the trees are. Well, it turns out the mangrove tree crab is shifting its range alongside the mangroves, and actually it's gone beyond where the mangroves are. It was thought to only occur where mangroves can live, so you wouldn't think you would find it anywhere else. Here's a map, this map of Florida. This star shows what was considered the northern range limit in 1918. Okay, so I guess no one really paid too much close attention to it and really marked the line for it. But then in 2014, Megan Riley published this paper in which she documented it going north with mangroves at the mangrove range limit, finding it on, this is Spartina alterniflora, the cordgrass, salt marsh cordgrass. So it's doing fine out there in the salt marsh. And she thinks that it might be so not only is this species outpacing mangroves, but it could be that it doesn't need mangroves as much as we thought it did, because the woody structure of mangrove roots is also, we could say, simulated by docks, right? Docks and piers and anything wooden that people put in the water. So it's possible that this species of crab is doing fine without its mangroves, although she did compare its population biology and ecology in different populations, and it looks like they're a little smaller as they get further north, but they also increase in density. So they're not waiting for the mangroves, they're not waiting for their hosts. They may have to change their name from mangrove tree crab to something else. Another experiment that was done more recently was Sam Chapman at Villanova University had a experiment called the wet feet experiment, and it's to look at how mangroves do with even additional warmer temperatures. So at this northern range limit, what happens in the future? Do they sort of reach some sort of peak and fall off or not? Turns out they do great. These chambers here are PVC pipes with some heavy duty plastic, and they're open on the top. So it just does ambient, or it just sort of does passive warming, but it allows the plants to grow up over the top. And they did achieve warming, like they measured temperatures inside and outside of these chambers. And there was an increase by about 1.6 degrees. So not a whole lot, but that's within the realm of what we're talking about for climate change. They found that mangroves do increase their growth, and both above ground and below ground, the roots have increased productivity. But then Spartina alterniflora, which is one of the salt marsh plants, actually, in general, like when they just wormed it by itself, it didn't have a negative effect. But when the salt marsh plants and the mangroves are together in the chamber next to each other, the Spartina alterniflora, the salt marsh plant, was having decreased root productivity. So not so good for the salt marsh plants. So as I mentioned, mangroves can be a good storage for carbon. The term is blue carbon for mangrove stored, or sorry, for carbon stored in ocean and intertidal coastal ecosystems. So mangroves are this huge depository for blue carbon, and that's known around the world. But the question is, in this ecotone, in this mangrove salt marsh ecotone, as mangroves move in, what's happening with carbon storage? And right now, what we know is that the below ground biomass in mangrove salt marsh ecosystems. So salt marshes are also important storers of carbon, but mangroves have a lot of fine root matter. They're woody and they actually make peat too. And so as mangroves start to increase in abundance in salt marshes and encroach, they are increasing the above ground storage quite a lot. So that's what's shown here in green. So in just a salt marsh, this was research done by Cheryl Dowdy. In salt marshes, the soil is shown salt marsh transitional, which is between salt marsh and then mangrove in this right-hand column. And the soil is shown in gray. The below ground biomass is shown in sort of the brown color, and then above ground biomass is shown in green. So you can see it's quite a lot larger in the mangrove specific areas. And what we see is that as time goes on and the mangroves get bigger and older, they actually store more carbon as well. Oops. Okay, so I'll wrap it up there about mangroves just to sort of give you some takeaways from that. The mangrove reproduction, growth, and adaptations to cold are all increasing at that range edge. So not only are they expanding, moving northward, sometimes due to hurricanes, but they're doing quite well at the range edge. Oops, sorry, my slides think got a mind of its own. Mangrove animals will respond at different rates. I just talked about the mangrove crabs, but there's other animals like I said, insects that various researchers have been tracking, and some of them are moving north, but not as quickly as the mangroves themselves. And we expect that carbon storage will continue to increase, which is an important aspect of climate change mitigation and thinking about global carbon sinks and carbon storage as well. So now I'll shift and talk about how climate change affects plant populations at trailing edges. So before we talked about mangroves at this leading edge of a range expansion. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, this plant Starflower is at a southern limit in the Chicago area in Illinois and Indiana as well. Southern Michigan, are all sort of these southern edges of the geographic range of this species. So in the United States, people who garden may know about plant hardiness zones, but this is a term that's used to describe what kind of plants you can plant year round in different zones. So each area has its own number on this chart. There's a whole lot of different ones, and they've changed recently. So this is a map from 2012. There are previous maps as well. This is a map from 2023, and what I'm going to do is just show you sort of zoomed in on the Midwest and Northeast, which are pretty similar in terms of the flora. At least some of the flora. So if we compare 2012 and 2023, you can see where the circle is. Chicago has become green, right? It's now 6A instead of 5B. So the higher numbers mean sort of more warmer, gentler climates for plants. That light blue color that was associated with number 5 has disappeared from Michigan, Ohio, and shrunk in Indiana. So we know that our plant hardiness zone is getting milder in these areas. We know climate change is happening. It's warmer. You know, we don't feel it every single day, but the long-term trend is that temperatures are increasing. And this is really important for plants. It's important for animals as well. In general, when we talk about the timing of something, the word for that is phenology. So the seasonal timing of a life event. So in the case of plants, that could be flowering. For animals, it might be migration. But the beginning of the growing season, it tends to shift earlier. And actually the end of the growing season is shifting later as well. So in general, there's a longer growing season in North America. There was a study by Kellen Callinger, several studies, but one that found that the increased temperatures throughout the growing season are having a disproportionate effect on plants that flower in the spring. So they're more likely to show some sort of phenological response, right? Like to shift their flowering time, for example, than something that flowers later in the summer. And that kind of makes sense if we think about something flowering in, May or April is going to experience colder temperatures more than something that flowers in August. And something that flowers in August may not even really be growing in April or May. So this is important because it can lead to what's called a phenological mismatch. So you could have a plant responding to warmer spring temperatures, flowering early, but then let's say it's a hummingbird pollinated plant, and hummingbirds and birds in general are responding to day length, right? Day length for their migration and when they should leave where they're wintering and head north. And it could be that they're smarter than just doing day length and they, take temperature into account too. But since day length doesn't change with climate, but temperature does, you can have this mismatch where the plants are flowering, they're making those resources that the pollinators really need, and the plants need the dispersal as well. And the pollinators, the birds maybe, or it could be something else, but the birds aren't there yet, right? And so then there's this mismatch and they can't reproduce and the birds don't have the resources that they expect to have when they show up. And this has happened in other things too, not just pollinators, like caribou, other migratory animals. So this is something that can apply to other ecosystems. In understory plants in particular, so a lot of the plants that flower in the spring are understory woodland plants. So one of my favorite things to do in spring is take a walk in the woods and look to see who's blooming. And what's interesting about that is they do almost all of their photosynthesis for the year before the trees have leafed out and the canopy is closed. So there has been another study by Heberlinger that showed that the understory plants they are responding to temperature, but the trees are actually responding at a different rate. And so the trees are also responding and starting to flower, or not flower, but leaf out and close that canopy before the understory plants are quite ready for them. So the window they have to do photosynthesis is actually shrinking, which is kind of interesting and a bit alarming. So I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to look at some plants in Illinois, where we have a little bit more than 2,000 native plant species. 16% of those are listed as either threatened or endangered in Illinois, and of those threatened and endangered species, it's estimated that 80% of them are vulnerable to climate change. And that can be for several reasons. Barriers to migration, meaning like they can't get to suitable habitat, or there is no suitable habitat for them to get to, is a big one. A lot of Illinois is farmland, and the Chicago area, there's a lot of cities. So it could be that those plant species, they just can't get somewhere that they can grow. So as I mentioned, I'm interested in this idea of trailing edges and what's happening here. So I chose a few species to focus on, one of which is Starflower, which is shown here on the right. It's known as Trientalis borealis. It was renamed Lysimachia borealis, but it didn't really stick, so everyone's just calling it Trientalis still. It's threatened in Illinois. And then I also chose to study the Canada Mayflower, and I had some students work on that. I don't have as much data for that because it was added later, and we didn't do all the field work that we did for that species as we did for the Starflower. But I'll just show you what we found for both of these. So both of these species are components of what's sometimes called the Canadian carpet, which is they're very abundant in northern forests, the northwoods of Canada, Minnesota, northwoods of Wisconsin, and northern Michigan. And so in this case, at least for these species, it's thought that warm temperatures might be important in setting the southern range limit. So here we are at the southern range limit. Let's see what's happening with temperature and these species. So in the case of, particularly for Starflower, I wanted to know what is the relationship between flowering phenology, so the time of year or the date when plants flower, and climate variables like temperature, and let's look at precipitation too, because that could be, if temperature is not important, maybe precipitation is. And how do flowering and fruit set actually vary across Midwestern populations? So we're going to look at temperature, precipitation, and flowering phenology, and then also some field work on flowering and fruit set in these different populations. So what I did was use several methods, one of which was herbarium records. So an herbarium is a collection of plants that have been dried and pressed. Botanists going back several hundred years collect plants from all over the world, and also currently people still do this. It's important for science. And there's a great herbarium at the Field Museum in Chicago. Many universities have them. The Chicago Botanic Garden has an herbarium. So there's been this effort recently to digitize all these specimens that are, sometimes hundreds of years old, sometimes 50 years old, sometimes 1 year old. But so that's been really excellent because especially say during the pandemic or any time that you can't get somewhere in person, you can log on to a website and find a lot of, if not all of the specimens that have been digitized. So there's this consortium of Midwest herbaria that collects information from all over the country, even not just the Midwest. But basically, I used some information from iNaturalist.org, which is another favorite website of mine that I think is really empowering for all citizen scientists. Anyone can take a photo and upload it there. And if you don't know what you're taking a photo of, it will tell you. There's some machine learning, but then there's real humans that can check, and everyone can get involved into that. So that's pretty fun. I recommend doing that. But we also use that for this study, and other people have used it as well for different studies looking at flowering and other things around the country. So both Canada Mayflower and Starflower, you can find herbarium specimens for. You can find them on iNaturalist as well. People walking in the woods and taking photos. So what we did was we identified flowering windows for each of these species. Typically, both of them flower in late May or early June. And then as I mentioned, other spring flowering species have been shown to be sensitive to temperature over the 3 or 4 months prior to flowering. So I got temperature data from NOAA and looked at both the sort of March through May temperature and then also just May temperature. So in this case, how does flowering respond to temperature? I found that with Starflower, as the March through May mean temperature in Celsius is on the x-axis, and then flowering date is on the y-axis. In flowering date January 1st would be day 1 of the year, and so May 15th is represented as day 135. So that's one of the earlier flowering dates on this graph. So what we found is that as spring temperatures increase, flowering date gets earlier in the year. And so lower numbers on the y-axis are earlier, and then higher numbers are later in the year. And if we break this up by where these plants are, it becomes apparent that the Illinois and Indiana populations, which are a bit further south, tend to be warmer, and their flowering date's a little later than Minnesota, most of Michigan, and then Wisconsin's kind of in the middle. You can see, generally Minnesota is experiencing colder springs than Illinois and Indiana, But the important thing is that across these 5 different states, we see this trend, right? So that we can expect that temperature will, like plants in these different places will respond to this temperature preceding flowering. So I actually, upon further analysis and herbarium records, I ended up breaking this into, so I ended up looking, it turns out that I did a bunch of study analyses, which I deleted from the slide, so I don't have to bore you with statistics. But it turns out that there was actually the strongest link with just May temperature, not March, sort of that mean of March, April, May temperature. And then I did a further sort of subset of the data and broke it up into southern populations and more northern populations. And I broke that up along this line of 45 degrees latitude, which in Wisconsin, that corresponds approximately to this area called the tension zone, which is where the climate changes, it becomes cooler as you go north of that, and the plants change too. So the ecosystems change from this sort of oak woodland savanna to the more north woods, what we think of as if you go into the north woods, pines, there's fewer oak trees, you get more paper birches and white pines and red pines. And so you can see that even though this plant species, Starflower, occurs in both of those places, it's actually responding a bit differently to temperature. So in those different latitudes. So I'll go through this. So the dark line is the southern populations, represents the southern populations, and then the gray are the northern populations. So flowering date is on the y-axis and temperatures on the x-axis. So as temperature increases, flowering date gets earlier in general, but for northern populations, that's more pronounced than for southern populations. So this is kind of interesting because it means that northern and southern populations may actually be responding differently to temperature, and that we would say that the northern populations are more phenologically responsive to temperature than the southern populations. So it could be that not great if the southern populations aren't responding the same way, like they are not responding to temperature, they're just going to flower whenever they flower. Or it could also be that there just wasn't as much variation in those southern populations and temperature, so that's why we don't see the sort of that responsiveness. I did promise a little bit on Canada Mayflower. It also responds to that spring temperature, so the warmer the temperature, the earlier the flowering in a given site, right? So, and I broke this up by several states, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. That's what we had data for. And you can see that, once again, the Illinois populations tend to be warmer on average than Wisconsin or Minnesota. And so we are seeing some phenological responsiveness here as well. For Starflower, the flowering date is actually, so this is now looking at flowering date through time. So this is, each dot is one herbarium specimen, or sometimes more recent, like I had a few, iNaturalist and field observations. But most of these are herbarium specimens going back to 1880, or just before 1880 actually. And so that flowering date is on the y-axis. And once again, I broke this up into the southern, below 45 degrees north latitude, and then at or above that. And you can see there's a difference here in the line. So if we look at that black line on the bottom, it's pretty flat, meaning those southern populations haven't really changed their flowering date at all through time. But the northern populations have, it's going down, which means in general, flowering is earlier for northern populations. So flowering is happening earlier in the year now than it was 50 or 100 or 140 years ago. So this plant is really abundant in northern Minnesota and in northern Michigan and northern Wisconsin. It's rare in Illinois, and it's really, we can see that it's responding. It's responding to climate change, but it's responding slightly differently in these different populations. So I'll talk a little bit about reproduction along that latitudinal gradient here, which is sort of a proxy for climate. What I did is at several populations throughout Illinois to northern Illinois to northern Minnesota, sampled, visited populations to see how many were flowering. And I should mention, well, why can't you just do that from the herbarium specimens? Typically, herbarium specimens are collected only when they're flowering. Sometimes you get an exception to that. You might get something with seeds, but typically people want the flower in the herbarium specimen. So it's a great place to study that. But if you're trying to figure out how many individuals in a population are flowering, that's not the best data set to use. So what I found is that in general, I should also mention too, most of these species, including starflower and most of these understory woodland species that flower early in the spring, can reproduce clonally. So they can just like make another little tuber and there's another plant, but they're genetically identical. So flowering is the sexual reproduction. It's the way that there's genetic diversity introduced, and that can be really important for climate change adaptation, or just adaptation in general to local conditions. So as we move north in the Midwest, we see an increase in the percent of the flowers or of the plants in individual population that are flowering. Kind of lower percentages down here in Illinois, and then increasing as we move further north. And then if we look at the summer temperatures in those places, we see a decrease as we go north as well. So then I was just wondering, the summer temperature is important, not so much for flowering, but for seed set, right? So the plants that will actually go on to set seed from a flower. And interestingly, the seed set graph looks very similar to the flowering graph. So kind of lower percentage of seed set in Illinois and higher as we move further north. And there's one extra population in Illinois because I missed its flowering, but I was able to visit it during seed set. So it's interesting because this is a species that's rare in Illinois. It's already, some of its populations are very small, like less than 50 individuals. And some of them just aren't doing so well. They're not flowering a lot. They're not really producing a lot of seed. But others are. This one here, this is actually one of the largest populations. It's producing seeds. It's probably doing pretty well. And then as we move further north, there's a lot of seeds, like almost 100% of them are setting seed in northern Minnesota. So that is, I would say, great for the species in general. In general, the plant is doing just fine. In Illinois, some of these populations aren't doing so well. Both these species, Canada Mayflower and Starflower, are showing phenological responsiveness, but the flowering, at least for Starflower, is advancing earlier in northern populations and not southern populations. And I don't know if it's because those trailing edge populations are small and low in genetic diversity and not able to adapt, or if it's the opposite and they're small because they're not able to adapt. So like, we don't know, chicken or egg, which one is happening. But in general, once, plants can be really locally adapted, which is great. But when their population size gets really small, then they don't always, but they can go through something called inbreeding depression, where they just don't have enough genes to deal with novel situations. So this low flowering, low fecundity could have multiple causes. They're often in these smaller populations that I mentioned, fragmented, so they're not really getting a lot of gene dispersal between populations. And it could be just that the sites are kind of degrading over time as well, as there's pollution, urban sprawl, etc. But the good news is I don't think we will lose the plant from the planet. We just may or may not have it in Illinois in the future, this particular species or these species in general. So to sort of wrap up everything I've told you, some species, we can see plants responding different ways to climate change. Some plant species expand their ranges, others may be contracting their ranges. We do see shifts in phenology with flowering and with other things, like even when plants lose their leaves in the fall, they tend to be extending that time now. We also, I'll just mention too, the sort of the shifts in phenology can be more important for some species than others. So something like long-lived species are less sensitive to, say, a 1-year change in reproduction than a short-lived species. Growth may be more important for like a lot of trees or a lot of long-lived species. And then if you think about, say, oak trees, which that's a whole other topic on oak trees and climate change, but like they may have mast years, right? So they have 1 year where they reproduce a lot and then several years where they don't reproduce as much. Um, Plants are going to be exposed to new climate conditions, right? Even if we stop all our greenhouse gas emissions today, the climate will continue to warm for 50 to 100 years. So there's going to be new climate conditions. There's going to be new biotic interactions, meaning new species in the same place that have not been together before. So things are going to be different and we have to accept that. But what can we do about it? Right? So we're going to accept that climate change is happening. We're accepting that there's going to be differences, right? It's not going to be the same way things always were. But one thing we can do if we care about plants, we care about native plants, is that we can create more habitat, right? So we can convert existing habitat. And I know Natural Habitat Evanston is all about converting lawns to other habitat. We can protect existing habitat, and that's true in our own backyards, in our own neighborhoods, and around the world. We can lower our carbon footprints. So there's lots of ways of doing that, like eating local, composting, driving less, carpooling, etc. One thing that I've been involved in since I stopped being a professor is keeping carbon dioxide in the forests that are standing. So there's a lot of talk about planting trees, which is great, but existing trees store way more carbon than new trees. If you look at a seedling or a sapling, they're small, right? They don't have a lot of carbon yet. But tropical forests do have a lot of carbon, and tropical deforestation contributes about a fifth of our greenhouse gas emissions every year to the atmosphere. So the company I work for now actually protects trees in tropical forests by partnering with communities and financing their own development in a way that they don't have to cut down the trees and the forest that they live in. So if that's interesting to you, I put a link where you can actually buy carbon credits if you'd like, standfortrees.org/forests. And I want to also acknowledge native plants in Illinois is the main focus of the Illinois Native Plant Society, of which I'm currently the president. It's a volunteer role. It's an all volunteer organization. We have activities throughout the state of Illinois. You can go to our website, illinoisplants.org, to see some of our upcoming events. We do a lot of grants. So some of the funding for my Starflower study came before I was on the board. I got a grant from the Illinois Native Plant Society to do that. And we fund somewhere between 4 and 8 projects a year that have something to do with Illinois, Florida. They don't all have to be with climate change. There's a lot of field trips and workshops where you can learn more from experts. I'd say our sort of niche in the ecosystem of plant and conservation focused organizations is that we really are dedicated to the study and appreciation and conservation of Illinois' native flora. So we have a lot of scientific expertise. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be a scientist at all to go to any of our stuff, but we do a lot of scientific expertise. And so we really try to promote more study of the science of native plants in the state as well. And there's a big event coming up next month in Southern Illinois that anyone's welcome to join. And registrations on the website. And then the membership for the Illinois Native Plant Society starts at $25 a year. So and $15 for students. And we even have sponsored memberships for people that cannot make those membership dues work for them. So I'll just do quick acknowledgements for people and places that were involved and funding that was involved in these studies that I talked about today. And then I'll leave you with an image of my children's book, Meet the Trees, which is all about anthropomorphic trees. That's an image from the inside with Juneberry. It's a rhyming picture book that is great for kids like age 3 to 8. And I will stop and take any questions.
Terrific. Well, Emily, thank you so much. And I'm so glad you talked about keeping existing trees standing too. So, thank you so much for all of this. I think, yeah, there are lots of questions about it, but and what's next? And it seems like there is endless research that needs to be done about the interaction of species and what happens as the mangroves move north. What happens to, all the other species that rely on the salt, reeds and grass. I don't know. But anyway,
Yeah.
there are a couple of questions so let me ask those that
Yeah.
are in the chat. Um, let's
Yeah, I
see.
see the first one is about sourcing native seeds. Yeah, so that's it's a great question. Prairie Moon Nursery in Minnesota is a great place to get native plants in the Midwest for sure. It's interesting though because yeah, if you're operating under the assumption that more cold hardy is better, um, it doesn't always work that way. And I was on the committee for a master's thesis at Northwestern where the student was actually comparing individuals from southern nurseries that may be kind of more adapted to the warmer climate. That was the thought. And he didn't actually find that. So he didn't find that, southern was better necessarily for survival and adaptation. So I think it's hard because local adaptation is a big thing in plant populations. Like they really, like even with the mangrove stuff I showed, there's this increased freeze tolerance at those northern range edges. So I would say don't worry too much about it. And there was a study actually that the Illinois Native Plant Society funded in the past couple of years where they looked at the genetic diversity of plants that are sold through nurseries. I think Prairie Moon may have been one of them. Possibility Place maybe was another one. And they found, it sort of depends on the species, but they typically do source from the wild when they can, right? Like from byways and sort of like next to the highway under the electrical lines, like sort of those species. And then I think they propagate some of their own as well. Um, I wouldn't worry. I just wouldn't worry too much about it. I think I don't have like a great answer of yes, this is the place to go for this species and this is the place to go for this other species. But you could ask them too where their plants come from and if they think they're you know, more climate adapted
Well,
to one area. Yeah.
the forest preserves actually make you a very limited, dispersal there. What do you think
Right.
about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's because of this local adaptation and local genes, right? So like there's some concerns that if, say, I take a plant from, I don't know, northern Minnesota and I plant it in my backyard, which, you know, it could, let's say it just like takes over and starts intermingling with the local population of that species, that it could be introducing genes that are maladaptive for this area, right? That
Right.
are, yeah, more cold, like better for cold, but not as good for heat, right? So like that is a valid concern. I would say probably like 75 to 90% of people planting stuff, or maybe more than that, don't think about that, right? And I think if you're planting in your own backyard, it's probably not a huge deal. If you're doing a large scale restoration, I would say it's something more to consider of where are these plants really coming from? Do we want them reproducing with the native plants in the forest preserve right there? Like maybe not.
Right.
If you
Right.
live right next to a forest preserve, and maybe think about it a little bit more. Like, tit. This is a big question. It's an unanswered question of like, is local better if we're restoring and trying to be climate hardy, or should we mix it up and kind of see what happens?
So there's one question before that one you mentioned. Have any studies looked into whether there are genetic differences between the leading and trailing edge mangroves and mangrove associated species in the potential role of climate change?
Yeah, so mangrove, so interestingly, with mangroves, we don't actually, there is no trailing edge really because they're tropical. And so you think about like their center is sort of around the equator, and the northern edge is the edge where they're moving. And then the southern edge in their case is actually like southern hemisphere. So it's sort of the same idea as what's going on in Florida. They're just that may be more ocean currents and ocean temperature than freezes, but it sort of depends. Anyway, if we there are differences between, say, those leading edge mangroves and equatorial populations for sure. I mean, even within Florida, there's there's a lot of differences within populations. Um, I think the role of climate change is sort of what I talked about a little bit already, is that at the northern edge, like they're just more locally adapted to colder temperatures than they are even within, like, compared to southern Florida. Like if you individual mangroves from Miami are going to be less freeze tolerant than a plant growing in St. Augustine, because they get, it's kind of like hardening off your plants in the spring, right? But there's more traits, like they are what we call plastic, right? So they can change their leaf architecture and change the way that they live. But if you just take a plant and throw it that's used to tropical weather and throw it out in the cold, it doesn't always do as well.
Right, right. Okay. Same person asked a question about, well, you better read this one. Similarly for species,
Yeah, so for species such
I
as
don't know whether this,
Myanthana, which seems to be doing well in Evanston where there's habitat for it, yeah, such as Perkins Woods, has experiment been done of transplanting a leading edge specimen to the trailing edge, so to see if phenology tracks with the specimen or local ecology. I don't know of one that's been done specifically, like a transplant experiment for that species. There have been warming experiments in Minnesota where they're actually warming the woods. I think the experiment, it may be done. I'm not sure if they're still doing it. It's called Before Warmed. And they are doing, studies where they're warming plots up in the woods. And there was a study that looked at Myanthemum specifically. But yeah, to see, so there's the student I mentioned at the Chicago Botanic Garden, or Northwestern program, he did some like transplants from different populations, but I don't think I can give you a satisfactory answer right now because I think it depends on the species. But once again, Myanthemum, not rare, or not, it's not threatened or endangered in Illinois. Starflower is, right? So does that tell you all you need to know, right? Like, is it like, oh, this is a common species, it's doing fine, whereas the rare species that are also boreal, but there's just fewer of them, are they just like a little bit more sensitive to those habitat conditions? And or if you were to transplant Starflower in Perkins Woods, maybe it would do fine, you know?
okay.
Let's see. Does the fact that precocious mangroves are producing when they are small suggests they may stay small? That's a good question. So, I think in general, we see the mangroves at the northern range edge are smaller, but I don't think that they're stunted per se. We see when we add nitrogen, they grow quicker and resemble what are called. So a lot of those pictures I showed were of mangroves in salt marsh. They're kind of shrubby, but they're also in from the water's edge by a bit. And the ones that are right on the water's edge, they're really just getting more nutrient flushing. They're getting less dehydrated every day. They grow more tree-like. So they probably will stay small, but I don't think it's necessarily that like they're kind of live young, live fast, die young. I don't think it's that strategy. I think it's that they may live a long time, but they're starting reproducing earlier. And I think that it could be related to their growth habit and the habitat. I think it may have something to do with the fact that there's so much light and there's not competition from the other trees that they would typically be in. Yeah.
Well,
But
thank you
they
so
yeah.
much. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, I was just saying they will stay small, but not because of that. So yeah.
Well,
Right.
we've kept you past the hour, so we so appreciate you. Thank you so much for everything you're doing, and thank you for talking with us.
Yeah. Thanks for listening and thanks for the questions.
Thanks.
Right. Bye.